Our second reading today is from the Gospel according to Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 33. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time, the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning, he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." And may God speak to us through these verses today. Some of you have heard me tell this story before, but the great American writer Mark Twain once took a tour of the Holy Land with his wife. One night he decided to take her for a boat ride on the Sea of Galilee. He found a man with a boat, asked him, "How much would you charge?" Well, the man looked at Twain. He's an American and he's in very expensive clothes. Figures he's probably pretty wealthy. He says, so the guy with the boat named a pretty high price for his boat ride. Twain, known for his sharp wit, turned away and said, "Now I know why Jesus walked." Matthew, Mark, and John include the story of Jesus walking on the water, the Sea of Galilee. Luke leaves it out. Only Matthew adds the part about Peter stepping out of the boat to join Jesus on the sea. The verses say that Jesus ordered the disciples to cross the sea and wait for him on the other side. He wants to be alone for a while to pray. But hours later at dawn, the disciples are still in that boat. They're still now stuck in a storm. Suddenly, in their fear and panic, they notice a figure coming toward them, and they're terrified. We're told they think it's a ghost. But then a voice calls out, "It's me, Jesus, don't be afraid." And there he is, walking on those waves toward them. Now, I don't know about you, but even if it did look and sound like Jesus, I think I'd still be a little upset or scared. What's he doing out in the middle of the sea in the middle of a storm? What if it is an evil spirit only pretending to be Jesus, trying to trick them? Maybe that is why Peter puts him to the test. "If it is you, Lord, tell me to come out there with you." And so Jesus says, "Come on, come out with me, Peter." Peter does. Now, I've often wondered too, why didn't the other disciples try to maybe talk him out of that? "Don't be a fool, Peter. Your nickname is the Rock. You'll sink." Or do they just sit there silently waiting to see what would happen? And maybe Peter is as amazed as anyone that he doesn't simply sink to the bottom. Instead, he takes a step and then another. He's actually doing it. But then he notices that storm, the fierce wind, the waves, and he gets scared and he starts to sink. That's when Jesus reaches down to pull him up and helps him back into the boat. "You of little faith, Peter, why did you doubt?" Now, as I mentioned when I preached on the story of the feeding of the 5,000, as with any miracle story, we each kind of have to decide for ourselves what kind of miracle it was or what are we looking for in this. And the same is kind of true here. Is the real point of this story that Jesus could walk on water, or is there some other point, some other meaning? Matthew could have just ended his story with Jesus coming to the disciples on the sea like Mark and John do, but he adds that incident with Peter. Jesus promised his followers that with faith they could perform miracles too. And so does that include us? Can we perform miracles? Well, I'm pretty sure that I can't leave here right now and go to the Ohio River and stroll over to the other shore. I also think it is a big theological mistake if we read a story like this one and assume that it means that Jesus will simply reach down and miraculously save us from every danger. We know better than that, really. I think that whenever we are confronted by a miracle story, I've often said our question should not be, did this really happen? But what is it trying to tell us? So, what might this story mean to us? Maybe it helps if we know something about what ancient people thought about the sea. Back then, the sea was not simply this body of water with fish in it. They believed that monsters and demons lived down in those cold, dark depths. They believed these monsters were the ones who would stir up the storms. So no wonder the disciples were frightened to see a rather ghostly figure walking out on that water. It must be one of those evil spirits. If you go back all through Scripture, the sea is often portrayed as the home of evil, of chaos. It's out of human control. It's a source of great fear. And so some have suggested that the importance of this story is not that Jesus was walking on water, but that he was walking on the sea, that he was walking unafraid on the surface of something that gave them a lot of fear. Anybody remember the old Bob Newhart show where he's a psychiatrist? I remember an episode that's always stuck with me where he's trying to help a patient who is so afraid of everything that he can't lead a normal life. And Bob reminds the patient of what Franklin Roosevelt once said, that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And the patient says, well, that's my biggest fear. Fear. Fear is part of being human. We fear illness, death. We fear losing our jobs. We fear our relationships will fail. We fear that terrible events will overwhelm us. We fear being hurt or ridiculed. We fear stepping out into the unknown or going beyond the traditional. And so we often devote a lot of time and effort to worry, trying to make ourselves feel safe, trying to keep things the way they are. But what happens if we spend too much time and effort on all that is that we become prisoners of our fear. And frankly, the truth is, no matter how secure we try to be, something is always, eventually, going to get through to us. Only we could overcome our fears. Then we would be better equipped to handle these things when they do happen. If we no longer fear the worst, even death, then the worst no longer has a hold on us. We are free of it. And in that freedom, we can really live. And isn't that really what Jesus says he offers us? Free, abundant life. Fear is what prevents us from being bold in our faith, too. Fear that we will be ridiculed or ostracized, and in some parts of the world, even condemned and punished. When Matthew wrote his gospel, Christians were being persecuted and killed. That was the stormy sea that they were trying to row on back then. One of our biggest fears may be never knowing what Jesus might ask of us. A fear that he will call out to us where that water is a bit rough and ask us to come walk where we usually never walk. And so a lot of times we keep Jesus out there on the fringe of our lives where he can stay a ghost, a faint image, or an idea with no real substance in our lives. Don't let him get too close. There on the stormy sea, Peter and the disciples saw Jesus walking just calmly and easily across their fears. And maybe it's in that moment that Peter realizes something, that sometimes we have to face our fears and trust that we are not facing them alone. After all, that is Jesus calling him out there. It's not just some guy. One commentator reminds us that Peter is usually the one who says and does what the others are afraid to do. Because Peter seems to know what we sometimes forget. When it comes to something like faith, there are times when we must take chances, when we need to come off the sidelines into the game, to take risks, even if we fall on our faces now and then. Because if faith is worth anything at all, isn't it really worth everything? Peter understands that following Jesus is not a spectator sport. It is not about playing it safe. Jesus didn't play it safe. He risked his own life and he lost it. Some people never get out of the boat, even if the boat is leaking and they're up to their knees in water. Peter knows there are times when we have to leave the security of our little boats and step out in faith into the unknown, trusting that Jesus is there. Faith, my friends, is the answer to fear. And sure, it is not always so easy to let our faith conquer our fear. Fear is hardwired into us. It is evolutionary. It is a natural instinct for self-preservation. But faith is something we have to learn and develop, like a muscle that we need to exercise and build up. You of little faith, Jesus says to Peter, why did you doubt? And I don't think Jesus is yelling at Peter. I don't think he's angry with them. I think it's more like, Peter, you were doing it. It was happening. Why did you give into your fear and let it pull you under? You know, frankly, Jesus often criticized all of his followers for the weakness of their faith, and yet he never abandoned them. Seems like Jesus did not really have what we might call a quota system for faith. Seems like even just a little bit can make him happy. And as for Peter, there is a reason why he gets more gospel time than any other disciple. Do you ever notice that? Peter gets more gospel time than anybody else because he is a symbol of the church. Peter is the spokesperson for our common humanity. Because, like Peter, our walk toward Jesus is shaky and unsteady. Like Peter, we get some things right and some things terribly wrong. Like Peter, we obey Jesus and we deny him. Like Peter, we are a mixture of courage and cowardice, of wisdom and foolishness, of belief and doubt. There is always a little fear in our faith, my friends. But there is also always a little faith, or should be, in our fear.